Well, well, look at you, still breathing, still moving through your days with that unshakable composure that refuses to bow, refuses to tremble, refuses to dim. No matter how many sideways glances or whispered narratives tried to stick to your name, they thought pressure would make you fold. They thought repetition would turn rumor into truth. They thought if enough voices spoke at once, reality would eventually follow the noise. They were wrong. They called people in one by one, old acquaintances, former rivals, individuals who once believed they understood you well enough to define you. Each of them carried a version of the story slightly different, slightly exaggerated, polished to sound convincing. They expected alignment. They expected confirmation. They expected a clean narrative to emerge from repetition. But something unexpected happened. The stories didn't line up. Not cleanly. Not naturally. Each retelling bent a little too far in one direction. Each explanation needed too much effort, too many emotional spikes, too much performance. And slowly, quietly, the room began to notice the difference between what was being said and what had actually been seen. Because while they were busy explaining you, you were busy being consistent. You didn't rush to clarify. You didn't jump into debates. You didn't issue dramatic statements or demand understanding. You stayed where you were, steady, composed, unchanged. And that music, steadiness became impossible to ignore. People started comparing notes, not because you asked them to, but because something felt off. The accusations were loud. Your behavior was calm. The contrast did the work for you. This is where narratives start to collapse, not with confrontation, but with comparison. Someone noticed that every claim about you relied on emotion, not evidence. Someone else noticed that the people speaking the loudest were also the ones shifting their story the most. Another noticed that while others were reacting in spikes and surges, you were moving at the same pace you always had. No urgency, no panic, no sudden reinvention. Consistency has a way of exposing instability without saying a word. They tried to frame your calm as indifference that didn't hold. They tried to label it avoidance. That didn't fit either because you weren't disappearing. You were present, observable, measurable. The same tone, the same posture, the same rhythm day after day. And eventually, people stopped asking what was being said about you and started asking why it didn't match what they were seeing. That's when doubt crept in, not toward you, but toward the story built around you. You see, false narratives survive on momentum. They need constant feeding. They need outrage, reaction, reinforcement, music. And you gave them none of it. You didn't fuel the fire because you weren't standing in it. You let it burn itself out on thin air. And as it did, the ones who started it grew louder, sharper, more erratic. Overreaction became their tell. Meanwhile, you remain readable in the simplest way possible. Not transparent, just consistent. There's a moment when observers stop listening to words and start watching patterns. That moment doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives with silence. People begin to notice how often certain names appear only in chaos, and how others appear unchanged, no matter the environment. They notice who escalates and who stabilizes, who reacts and who regulates. That's when reality begins to correct itself. Someone mentioned Elon Musk in passing, not as a comparison, not as a shield, but as an example, a name so visible that it can't hide behind narrative, a reminder that scale doesn't come from noise alone. That credibility isn't built on explanation, but on alignment between action and outcome. When a name carries weight, People stop asking how loud the story is and start asking how accurate it is. That mention lingered not because it elevated you, but because it reframed the conversation. It reminded people that reputation isn't sustained by performance. It's sustained by coherence over time. And suddenly your silence didn't look like absence. It looked like confidence without display. The people who once tried to corner you began hesitating, not because you pushed back, but because their own certainty started wobbling. They reread messages, replayed conversations, compared timelines, and each time they did, the same problem surfaced. You hadn't changed. The story had accusations need escalation to survive. Integrity doesn't. You watched it happen without stepping in. You let people arrive at their own conclusions. One by one, support formed. Not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. Someone defended you without being asked. Someone else questioned the narrative out loud. Another simply stopped engaging with the noise altogether. None of it traced back to you directly. Music, and that's what made it credible. Truth doesn't recruit. It resonates. The more others tried to force a conclusion, the more their own contradictions surfaced. Dates didn't match. Motives shifted. Emotions ran hot where facts should have been cool. And the audience, the quiet observers who mattered most, began stepping back from the spectacle. They weren't impressed by intensity anymore. They were drawn to stability, and you were still there. Same presence, same restraint, same grounded pace. What unsettled them wasn't that you were winning. It was that you weren't playing. You didn't treat this like a battlefield. You treated it like weather, something that passes when it has no structure to hold it in place. You trusted time to do what force never could, and time listened. The narrative lost its grip, not because it was challenged, but because it became unnecessary. People moved on, not away from you, away from the noise. The ones who built their relevance on exaggeration found themselves without an audience. The ones who relied on reaction found nothing left to provoke. You didn't step forward to claim vindication. You didn't mark music the moment. You just continued. And in that continuation, something important became clear. Reality doesn't reward the loudest voice. It rewards the most consistent signal. This isn't the end of the story. Not yet. Because the full realization, the quiet understanding of what actually happened, hasn't fully settled in. There are still conversations replaying, still moments of recalculation happening behind closed doors, still people realizing a little too late that they misread the situation. And you're still moving the same way you always have, unrushed, unshaken, letting the rest catch up. And while all of this unfolded, you never announced a turning point. You didn't mark a victory. You didn't even acknowledge the shift. That's what made it unsettling for them. Most people need a moment where they can say, "This is where I prove myself." You didn't. You let the moment pass like it was always supposed to. Behind the scenes, people started asking quieter questions. Not the dramatic kind, the uncomfortable ones. Why did the story need so much effort to sustain itself? Why did it keep changing shape? Why did every retelling sound more emotional than factual? And why, through all of it, did you look exactly the same? That's when observation replaced opinion. People stopped listening to who felt the strongest about you and started watching who stayed consistent around you. They noticed how conversations changed tone when your name came up, how the ones who exaggerated the most also seemed the least grounded, how the ones who had actually interacted with you. Music spoke carefully, without urgency, without drama. Care is a test, so is restraint. You weren't trying to be mysterious. You weren't cultivating distance. You were simply refusing to perform. And in a world that confuses performance with power, that refusal became the loudest signal in the room. Time did what time always does. It separated reaction from reality. The louder voices began circling back on themselves, repeating points that no longer landed. Their confidence thinned, their certainty fractured. Each attempt to reinforce the narrative required more force than the last. That's the thing about exaggeration. It demands escalation. Calm doesn't. Calm just waits, and you waited without waiting. You kept living your life, showing up the same way, making the same decisions, holding the same standards, not to prove anything, but because that's who you are when no one is watching. And people could feel the difference between someone holding a position and someone holding a posture. Somewhere along the way, the comparison became unavoidable, not because anyone set it up, but because it emerged naturally. On one side, there was noise, volatile, reactive, constantly updating its own story. On the other side, there was you, steady, predictable in the best way, unmoved by the weather around you. That's when someone said it out loud. This doesn't add up. Not as an accusation, as an observation. Once that sentence enters the room, everything changes. Because now people aren't choosing sides, they're choosing coherence. They're choosing the version of events that requires the least distortion to believe. You never asked anyone to defend you, and yet defense formed quietly, independently. Someone corrected a detail in a conversation you weren't part of. Someone else questioned a claim without raising their voice. Another simply said, "That hasn't been my experience," and let the silence do the rest. Truth spreads like that, not in waves, in ripples. It reminded people of something they don't like to admit. Credibility isn't built by how aggressively music you speak, but by how little you need to explain. The more someone talks about their integrity, the more people start checking for it. You didn't talk about yours at all. There was a moment, subtle, almost unnoticeable, when the narrative stopped moving forward. Music, it didn't collapse dramatically. It stalled. It lost momentum. People stopped sharing it, stopped reacting to it, stopped finding it interesting. And without attention, it couldn't survive. What replaced it wasn't applause for you. It was recalibration. People began reassessing their own assumptions, not just about you, but about how easily they had accepted a story that required emotional investment, but offered no stability. Music. They noticed how quickly they had leaned toward intensity instead of accuracy. How familiar that pattern felt. How often they'd seen it before. Your role in all of this remained unchanged. You didn't step into the vacuum, you didn't claim space, you let the absence of noise speak for itself. At some point, someone referenced Elon Musk again, not as a comparison of status, but as a reminder of scale, of what happens when visibility, music meets consistency, of how at a certain level, stories either align with reality or collapse under their own weight. Big names don't survive on reaction. They survive on alignment over time. That reference didn't elevate you. It grounded the conversation. People realized this wasn't about defending you. It was about recognizing a pattern they'd seen before. When integrity doesn't respond, distortion eventually runs out of material. You weren't untouchable. You were simply not participating in the game that was trying to touch you. And that distinction mattered. Those who once tried to corner you now found themselves cornered by their own words, not publicly, internally. They replayed conversations, reread messages, not because you forced accountability, but because something about the outcome didn't sit right. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for conflict. Instead, they were left alone with their own overstatements. Silence can do that. It removes the distraction. You became a reference point without intending to be one. Not because you were central, but because you were stable. When people talked about what actually happened, your behavior became the control variable, the one thing that didn't fluctuate. And in analysis, that's everything. No one announced that the story was wrong. It simply stopped being useful. Support didn't arrive in the form of crowds or declarations. It arrived as alignment, as people choosing not to engage with exaggeration, as conversations shifting away from speculation and back toward observable behavior, as respect returning without being requested. Music. And still, you didn't change pace. That's the part they still struggle with, that you didn't need this moment. You didn't need redemption or recognition. You weren't waiting for the narrative to clear so you could move forward. You had never stopped moving forward. The pressure that was supposed to define you ended up defining them instead. Their urgency exposed their insecurity. Their insistence exposed their lack of grounding. And your restraint exposed nothing, because there was nothing to expose. Music, this isn't about winning. It never was. It's about coherence outlasting chaos. About integrity being heavier than accusation. About time favoring what doesn't need correction. And as this continues, because it's still continuing, you remain where you've always been. Not above it, not outside it, just steady within it, letting reality finish the work it already started. The full understanding hasn't landed yet. It's still forming, still settling into place. And you're not waiting for it. You're just being you. And that, as it turns out, is more than enough to let the rest unravel on its own. By the time it fully settles, there's no announcement, no apology tour, no dramatic reversal. Music, just a quiet understanding spreading from one person to the next, the way truth usually does when it doesn't need help. People start realizing that the story didn't end because you won. It ended because it couldn't survive scrutiny anymore. It required too much emotion to stay upright, too many explanations, too many edits, and eventually, people got tired of carrying it. You never asked them to stop. You never corrected them publicly. Music, you never demanded clarity. You let the weight of inconsistency do the work for you. And that's when the real shift happened. Not outside of you, but inside the room. Conversations changed, not about you directly, but about trust, about credibility, about how easily people confuse intensity for truth, about how often the loudest voice ends up being the least accurate. Your situation became a reference point, not because you insisted on it, but because it revealed something uncomfortable about how narratives are formed. Some people felt embarrassed, others felt exposed. A few felt relieved because deep down they had sensed the exaggeration early on, but didn't know how to name it without becoming a target themselves. Your calm gave them permission to slow down, to observe, to think. You didn't become louder when the pressure rose. You became quieter, more precise, more consistent. And consistency over time is undeniable. It doesn't argue, it accumulates. That's the part no one teaches you. Integrity doesn't need defense, it needs time. As the noise faded, what remained was behavior, yours, the same as it had always been. That's when people finally saw it clearly. Nothing about you required distortion to make sense, and everything about the accusations required it to survive. The ones who had leaned hardest into the story started pulling back first. Not because they were confronted, but because they felt the ground shifting beneath their certainty. When a narrative stops being echoed, it starts sounding strange even to the people who created it. Others followed quietly, one by one. Support didn't show up as loyalty, it showed up as discernment, as people choosing not to repeat things they couldn't verify, as pauses in conversations where drama used to rush in as a collective exhale. You noticed it, of course, but you didn't react to that either. You kept moving the same way, living the same way, holding the same internal line, because your life was never organized around correcting perception. It was organized around being aligned with yourself. That alignment is what carried you through. Not resilience in the dramatic sense, but coherence. You didn't fragment under pressure. You didn't split into who you are and who you needed to appear to be. You stayed whole, and wholeness is disarming. Eventually, even the most skeptical observers reached the same conclusion, not emotionally, but logically. If the claims were true, the behavior wouldn't look like this. If the character was flawed, the consistency wouldn't hold. If the story had substance, it wouldn't need reinforcement. Reality corrected the distortion the only way it ever does, slowly, invisibly, completely. There's no satisfaction in that moment, no urge to say, "I told you so." Because by the time it's obvious, it's also irrelevant. You're already elsewhere mentally, already past the need for recognition. What remains is quieter than victory. It's respect without ceremony, space without explanation, a recalibration you didn't ask for, but don't resist. People don't look at you the same way anymore, not because you demanded it, but because they can't unsee what consistency looks like under pressure. You become a reminder, whether you want to be or not, that truth doesn't. Music need urgency. That calm is not weakness. That silence can be evidence. And through all of it, you're unchanged, still grounded, still observant, still uninterested in proving anything to anyone who wasn't paying attention in the first place. That's the final turn they never expected. Not that the story would flip, but that it would simply dissolve, and you would walk forward untouched by the noise that once tried to define you, carrying nothing but the quiet certainty that you didn't need to fight to be understood. You just needed to stay real long enough for reality to catch up.